India and Pakistan are at each other's throats again. After a horrific terror attack against tourists in the disputed region of Kashmir, India's leaders have vowed revenge on Pakistan, insisting that it was India's long-term adversary that was truly behind the assault. Pakistan has vowed to stand firm, insisting that it isn't responsible, and pledged that if India should engage in combat, then Pakistan will defend itself with all its might. Troops are massing, heavy weapons are moving, and the international community is grasping at thin air, all but powerless to intervene. Yet at the heart of this crisis, the weapon that matters most can't be shot out of a gun or launched from an aircraft or even carried in the tip of an intercontinental ballistic missile. The most important weapon of all in this ongoing and rapidly evolving crisis is water. And if India has its way, then that weapon may well be used to devastate Pakistan and force it into subservience. Today we're going to talk about the Indus Waters Treaty, a weapon far more dangerous than a nuclear warhead, and one that India is already starting to deploy. Whenever we talk about an evolving crisis, like the one currently unfolding between India and Pakistan, we've got to issue a familiar caveat. Everything we'll be discussing in this episode is accurate only up to a certain time. In this case, the morning of Tuesday, May the 6th, local time in both New Delhi and Islamabad. As a result, any developments in the region that have taken place after that time, up to and including the outbreak of full-scale war, will not be accounted for in today's episode, although if the region really is at war by the time you see this, you can rest assured that we are already working on another episode to cover it. Also, because we've already published a full explanation of the spike in tensions between India and Pakistan quite recently, we're going to refer you to that prior episode to learn more about how we got here, instead of taking the time to rehash it now. A link to that episode is displayed on the screen, or you can find it in the description box below. Today, though, we're going to talk about water, because there is perhaps no more important factor in this entire conflict. Short of a full apocalyptic nuclear exchange, the damage that the nation of India can cause by manipulating the waters of the region is unparalleled by any other weapon available to either side of this conflict, including the use of smaller, low-yield tactical nuclear weapons. It's a bold statement. We are well aware of that, but let's play it out, shall we? The Indus Waters Treaty was signed all the way back in 1960 by the then leaders of the two countries involved, Jawaharlal Nehru of India and Ayub Khan of Pakistan. The objective of the treaty was a simple one: to govern and regulate the flow of the mighty Indus River, as well as several tributary rivers as they flow down from the Himalayan mountain range. The rivers are of particular importance, not just because of how much water they can carry, but the path that they take as they meander through the highlands. All 6 of the rivers pass through Indian territory, most of them through the India-controlled portion of the disputed Kashmir region, before they flow into Pakistan, slowly unifying with one another until they all converge in central Pakistan. The flow of the waters downstream from India poses an obvious problem, that India, if it ever wanted to, could cut off the flow of water being delivered into Pakistan. And that's no small concern for Pakistan either. The waters of the Indus are critical in sustaining some 80% of the nation's irrigated agriculture, meaning that if those waters were to dry up, the country's agricultural sector would collapse in short order. That could mean everything from missed crop yields and shortages in a water interruption that lasted a few months, to risks of a full-scale famine if India withheld the flow of water for years at a time. Conversely, if India were to hold and then release water in massive floods, it could devastate cities situated along the Indus or its tributaries, including Hyderabad, population 2.4 million, and Multan, population 2.2 million. Release those floods, and India could collapse dams in Pakistan downstream, adding more and more water in a cascading effect and destroying Pakistan's ability to regulate and use the river for a generation. Luckily for Pakistan, those were concerns that the regional leaders of the 1960s were able to see coming. When it was signed, the Indus Waters Treaty established strict water-sharing expectations for India, granting it control of 3 of the Indus River's tributaries, while the Indus itself and 2 western tributaries would be under control of Pakistan. India would receive 30% of their water, Pakistan would receive 70%, and India was made subject to limitations on how it used the water of the rivers, particularly regarding how much water it was allowed to siphon away, and preventing it from creating major dams with large catchment zones that could be flooded if India decided all of a sudden that it wanted to stop the flow of water. For decades, the Indus Waters Treaty has been heralded as one of the most successful water-sharing treaties in world history. Over the course of 3 separate wars against Pakistan, India never once violated the terms of the treaty, and nor did it take that action after several major terror attacks that India accused Pakistan of orchestrating or that have been traced back to Pakistani territory. The treaty has never been formally suspended, even in prior periods of crisis, despite Pakistan having little practical leverage to stop India from doing so. Not only that, but it's persisted despite the inherent unfairness of the treaty. India, by nature of the flow of the rivers, is the only party to really give anything up, and it receives no form of compensation, financial or otherwise, for ceding control of about 80% of the water flow of the Indus basin. The fact that the treaty has remained in effect for so long, despite all of that, has been a historic victory for the international order and for both nations, especially Pakistan, a nation that would have had its development stunted if the treaty had fallen apart sooner. So, when India unilaterally suspended the treaty in the wake of the 2025 terror attack in Kashmir, it was a decision that carried seismic ramifications. The news came just 1 day after the attack, a stunning turnaround time for a decision that reversed 6.5 decades of geopolitical precedent, and with it came terms from New Delhi. According to India's leaders, the treaty would remain suspended until, quote, Pakistan credibly and irrevocably abjures its support for cross-border terrorism. From that moment on, the treaty was no longer in effect, and it wasn't long before India began to demonstrate the extent of its newly seized control. Just before we continue, quick plug for our fantastic newsletter. Look, imagine never missing the critical details behind today's global events, those decisive moments and hidden narratives that shape our world. And that's exactly what you'll get with the WarFronts newsletter. Every week, you'll receive expertly curated insights into global conflicts, powerful military strategies, and analysis delivered directly to your inbox. No fluff, no noise, just crystal clear clarity wrapped in compelling stories and fascinating historical connections that you just won't find anywhere else. It's completely free, it's genuinely valuable, and signing up just takes a few seconds. There's a link below. Understanding the world just got a whole lot easier thanks to our newsletter. And now back to it. As we start to discuss the actions that India has taken to demonstrate its leverage over the Indus River and its tributaries, it's important to understand one key point. As of now, and at least for a few more months, India does not have the ability to cut off the flow of water into Pakistan outright. That, of course, is by design. Under the Indus Waters Treaty, India has avoided building any installations of the kind that could be used for leverage against its western neighbor, areas that could quickly become a reservoir if one of the rivers were to be dammed, currently don't have a suitable dam available to do the job. Areas where India could work to divert rivers into new catchment areas have yet to be converted for the purpose. Those steps are going to take time, and although we'll talk about them later in today's episode, it's premature to discuss them now. What India can do, however, is to make early use of the ability that it does have to alter the flow of the rivers, not by cutting off the flow entirely, but by reducing the flow a little bit, building up water and then releasing it downstream. For India to take those actions, even in a limited way where there's no real potential to cause damage, that sends a valuable signal to Pakistan, namely that India is serious about this and it really will divert the flows of these rivers as soon as it has the ability to do so, until and unless Pakistan agrees to its terms. The first instance in which India may have withheld and then released water came by way of the river Jhelum in late April, when viral social media posts coming from Pakistan showed a sudden and unexplained rush of floodwaters coming downstream. The claims that India had caused the rush of waters were later debunked when Pakistan's Water and Power Development Authority indicated that India had not caused the surge and that there was no flooding, flood risk, or damage coming from what was, by all accounts, a fairly typical swell of the river due to snowmelt. But by then, concerns were already rising that India could let loose in the near future, and over the weekend of May the 3rd and 4th, it appears that India did precisely that. On the river Chenab, India released waters by surprise from a pair of dams in disputed Kashmir. India had a decent explanation for the release. According to authorities, it was flushing the reservoirs of those dams, a necessary act to clear out silt and maintain good performance of the attached hydroelectric plants. But those flushing operations almost never happen at this time of year, and yet again, despite the fact that the surge of water downstream could be explained away, the relevance of the downstream flows simply couldn't be missed. The surprise element of those flows, in turn, leads us to another way that India can exploit the flows of regional waters to hurt Pakistan, namely by suspending its usual operations to track and relay information about the flow of water headed downstream. That's an effort that has already been suspended indefinitely, and while it doesn't particularly matter for normal day-to-day operations, it does have the potential to become very important very quickly. If, for example, unexpectedly heavy rains in India cause one or more of the rivers to surge, that would typically be communicated to Pakistan so that Pakistan can, in turn, take the appropriate action, perhaps releasing water from its dams to get ready for a new influx, perhaps even evacuating homes and settled areas along the riverbanks. Conversely, if India registers that there will be reduced flows downstream, Pakistan would usually take appropriate action by reducing its water expenditures downstream and making sure that it can ration whatever it has available. Just by declining to share that information, India already can make Pakistan far more vulnerable to regular shocks in its agricultural production capacity, usually fairly minor shocks, but not necessarily. And most recently, as of the time of writing, India can start and has started work on efforts to boost its holding capacity in the future. By building out dams, diverting rivers into new reservoir areas, and starting new construction, India can start work today on a series of water control installations that could go operational within anything from a few months to a few years. India is already working to boost its reservoir capacity at 2 critical hydroelectric dams in the Kashmir region, and it's likely to begin work on similar projects soon. The 2 new projects were not revealed to Pakistan, and each of them represents the first reservoir expansion work that's been done at the dams since they were first built. In Pakistan, the options to retaliate are few and far between. Military retaliation, basically off the table, at least as long as Islamabad wants to avoid any further escalation. After all, Indian assets are currently poised and looking for a reason to kick off full-scale hostilities, and Pakistani military action against Indus River targets would certainly suffice. As such, Pakistan is unlikely to risk, say, a missile strike against a location where India has begun to move construction assets into place to dam the river, or a sabotage attack against Indian hydroelectric power plants that are already operational. Nor can Pakistan retaliate in kind against India. After all, despite all the water flowing into Pakistan from India, there's hardly a drop of water that flows into India from Pakistan. And even if it did, India isn't even a fraction as reliant on the Indus River and its tributaries as Pakistan is. Diplomatically, Pakistani officials have indicated that they have a few options. Speaking to the outlet Reuters, Pakistan's Minister of State for Law and Justice, Aqil Malik, listed 4 potential directions that Pakistan could go. They could raise concerns with the World Bank, the organization that facilitated the Indus Waters Treaty. They could take it to one of 2 international courts in The Hague, or they could bring it to the United Nations Security Council. There are, however, reasons to believe that none of those options would bring success. Decisions made in The Hague's international courts are not enforceable unless either parties to the decision or international bodies like the UN decide to take up enforcement themselves. The Security Council, in turn, is sharply divided, with Russia in chronic opposition to Britain and France, America in chronic opposition to China, and all permanent members sharing complex and sensitive relationships with both India and Pakistan. Finally, although the World Bank could use the economic leverage over India to force a concession, India is the World Bank's largest international partner, with a president, a managing director, and a chief economist who are either from India or of Indian descent, all factors that may make the institution hesitant to take that sort of action. Alright, so it's at this point in the episode that you'd be forgiven for wondering just why we took this whole water thing so seriously at the outset. Sure, India can send little bursts of water downstream or decline to tell Pakistan when things are starting to dry up, but that's far from the deadliest weapon at India's disposal, let alone when compared to a nuclear warhead. Yet although, in the short term, that assessment is bang on, it falls apart as soon as we flip a few months ahead in the calendar. While India could cause more immediate damage to Pakistan by, say, dropping bombs over Karachi, the cutoff of the waters of the Indus Basin represents India playing the long game. And make no mistake, India will play that long game if it wishes. Said the nation's water resources minister just after the terror attack in Kashmir, quote, "We will ensure no drop of the Indus River's water reaches Pakistan." That's something that India can accomplish with enough time and enough labor, and the result, if that were to happen, would be devastating. We mentioned already that the Indus Waters Treaty governs rivers that sustain about 80% of Pakistani agriculture, but let's put those numbers in real terms. That 80% of Pakistani agriculture makes up about a quarter of Pakistan's entire GDP. It sustains 80% of the population of the world's fifth most populous nation, with an estimated 250 million residents at the time of writing. Not only that, but these areas are already under threat of long-term water scarcity caused by drought, and some parts of the nation are at risk of desertification if water remains scarce for years. In the medium term, India can cause hell for Pakistan during the upcoming dry season, when the flow of these rivers will already be at its annual low, and where India's ability to gather relatively small amounts of water will be more impactful, both because its small reservoirs will take longer to fill, and because in the meantime Pakistan will only get a trickle. That could lead to historically bad crop yields across the nation, causing pain that Pakistan would feel in relatively short order. But even that would be a mere shadow of what may come with more time, because both the highland topography of India-controlled Kashmir and the other areas where these waters flow before reaching Pakistan, and the many relatively sparsely populated locations along the routes they flow, India could begin displacing water into growing or new reservoirs with only moderate need for resettlement of its own people. That resettlement, in turn, would be far easier for India if the nation's crisis with Pakistan continues and the Indian government grants itself the power to displace people unilaterally under conflict conditions. India can build large dams, leveraging a national economy that has all the tools it could possibly need for such an undertaking. They could also dig diversion routes for water to flow, potentially for short distances, before settling into new reservoir areas. Be aggressive enough, work quickly enough, and India could very well cut off the entire Indus basin. Then, if India is playing relatively nicely by these catastrophic standards, it might force Pakistan to grant major concessions in exchange for limited flows of water, or it might choke Pakistan off for the long term. If you're curious about how the hell that could qualify as playing nicely, the alternative would be for India to collect all of their water and then release apocalyptic floods all across Pakistan, perhaps even timing the release for monsoon season so that it can devastate the landscape and then immediately go back to holding water for the following year or more. As we have explained, Pakistan probably couldn't do much to stop that. It could, in this hypothetical scenario, attempt to destroy those dams after they're built, but doing that would pose two problems. Not just the threat of immediate retaliation and war with India, but the fact that destroying the dams would still result in catastrophic floods, impacting Pakistan far worse than that hit India. Meanwhile, China could technically choke off the Indus River from India, since it originates in Tibet, before crossing the border, but that too comes with problems. In a technical sense, most of the waters that fill the Indus by the time it empties into the Arabian Sea collect from Indian territory or from other small tributaries that only collect into major rivers by the time they reach India proper. And in a diplomatic sense, China would likely be unwilling to take that sort of action, both because it could set off its own crisis with a demonstrably aggressive India, and because it might prompt India to use Pakistan as a bargaining chip and threaten a catastrophic release of waters before it loses the ability to do so. There is, however, a bright spot in all of this as it relates to India's handling of the current crisis after the terror attack in Kashmir. Right now, India is threatening military action against Pakistan, and Pakistan is saying that such action is likely to come sooner than later. India may or may not engage in that sort of attack, and if it does, it could do anything from calibrating a careful, inconsequential hit in order to save face and defuse the crisis, to leveraging its nuclear weapons in order to glass Karachi. But if India chooses to focus on projects to manipulate the flow of water in the Indus basin, whether or not those projects are accompanied by low-grade military action in the near term, then it might just give itself an off-ramp. The critical element to consider here is time. While in a geopolitical sense, it may not be accurate to say that time heals all wounds, it typically helps those wounds to sting a little less, and the same might be true for India. With tempers running high in New Delhi right now, there's a real appetite for direct action against Pakistan, but that could change in a couple of months, or even a few weeks. A hawkish element within India would certainly keep advocating direct action for quite a while, but the public may lose its appetite for retaliation far sooner than they do. This presents the Indian government with an interesting opportunity to give itself and Pakistan an off-ramp from this crisis without looking like it's giving itself an off-ramp. To start major construction on projects on the Indus and its tributaries, to start choking off the flow of water to Pakistan and sending warning shots downstream, those are some major symbolic actions. But the dams and the reservoirs won't be ready for months at best, and probably not for years. If India goes in that direction and makes a show in the short term of its efforts to dam the Indus and weaponize water against Pakistan, then it presents a real outlet for public anger and potentially also builds geopolitical tools in those dams that'll help it later. But it also creates time to find a settlement with Pakistan and defuse the crisis completely. If Pakistan is lucky, those dams might not ultimately be built at all if India were to decide that it's better to return to the status quo and gracefully stop construction after enough time has passed. But unfortunately for Pakistan, there are no guarantees that that's what India wants to do, and even if India did shift its focus to the Indus and its tributaries, there's another side to that coin. If India really did dam the rivers, if it really did create vast catchment areas to secure the waters of the region for itself, then it would create the possibility of a water crisis spanning generations. Narendra Modi and India's current government would be the ones to do the bulk of the early work, but it would be Modi's successor who would truly reap the benefits, and India's leader after that would be the one to usher the greater power and prominence that comes with having all but vanquished a long-time enemy. In this version of the future, one terror attack in Indian-controlled Kashmir could lead to a situation where India has built extreme leverage over Pakistan lasting for decades. With the vast proportion of its agricultural potential, and thus the vast proportion of its massive population living at India's mercy, Pakistan may be forced to accept all manner of restrictions, disarmament, and subordination to India's will just for the meager privilege of growing enough food to sustain its people. The alternative would be a humanitarian crisis on a scale not seen for decades across the globe, and given that most powerful nations on Earth would be responsible for dealing with such a catastrophe, they may well choose to encourage Pakistan to appease India instead. After decades of strategic non-alignment, no nation on Earth has the diplomatic clout that would allow them to prevent India from damming the Indus Basin if India was really committed to that cause. And while Pakistan could quite fairly regard that as an existential threat and thus resort to the use of nuclear weapons, when do you pull the trigger? Do you destroy yourself and your 250 million plus people when there was still the option to reach a deeply insulting but ultimately survivable settlement? Or do you use nuclear weapons after that settlement has been reached, after Pakistan and its people have already found ways to survive and swallow the bitter pill that's been fed to them? Without a doubt, cutting off the waters of the Indus Basin would create an existential threat to Pakistan. But not all existential threats involve an imminent threat. In a situation where India doesn't have to take any action at all and can simply allow water to pool and pool and pool into its reservoirs, what's Pakistan gonna do? If we step back for a second and examine these possibilities as they relate to the present moment in this long worldwide arc of history, it's looking to be about the time that someone was going to have the first major modern water war. With droughts getting longer, rains getting scarcer, and deserts expanding all across the globe, it was only a matter of time before a water-scarce region was pushed to the brink. Perhaps then, it's only fitting that the collapse of one of the best water-sharing treaties in history may well lead to a generations-long state of affairs where water is held by one nation like an executioner's sword above the head of the other. Make no mistake, that's where this crisis between India and Pakistan could lead if the crisis continues to play out on its current course and the two nations prove unable to find a better path forward. Right now, we can only hope that cooler heads will prevail, whether by diplomatic settlement or mutual de-escalation, or India choosing to threaten the Indus Waters Treaty today in order to give itself a convenient off-ramp tomorrow. The alternative is a water crisis unlike anything in modern history, with hundreds of millions of lives hanging in the balance. Thank you for watching.